Hi everyone, this is Know Your Food episode 138. For links and more, you can visit the show notes at knowyourfoodpodcast.com/138. Now let's begin. First of all, welcome to everyone who's joining me. I especially want to welcome everyone who's coming in live right now for this recording on Periscope. And for those of you that are listening later and want to get in on the fun, watch Periscope app. My handle is @TradCookSchool on Thursdays because I'm planning to make a habit of it of recording the podcast about a week ahead of time on Periscope, and it's really fun to be online with you because the hearts are flowing and people are chiming in and saying where they're from and giving feedback to what we're sharing, and it's really great. And so Amy in Georgia, thank you so much for sharing and for being here. So keep that in mind if you're a podcast listener and you've got some free time on Thursdays, watch Periscope or periscope.tv/TradCookSchool so you can join in the fun. So we are continuing this is the 6th podcast in a series on traditional cooking time-saving tips. And I have 5 more tips for you. Plus, all along, listeners have been submitting their tips. So I've got a collection of great tips from the Know Your Food podcast community to share with you at the end that are bonus traditional cooking time-saving tips. Podcasts 133 through 137 are the past ones. So you can go to knowyourfoodpodcast.com/133, etc. to go back and catch up if you haven't heard all the other traditional cooking time-saving tips I've been sharing. And I'd love to get your feedback and just share with me if any of those work for you or if you have additional tips, because, come along later. Even though the series is over, we all love to share. Let's see, I was going to say something and I lost it, so I'm just going to move on. Oh, what I wanted to say was just make sure we're all on the same page. Traditional cooking is the beautiful art of cooking that our great-grandmothers used to do, that our ancestors used to do when we did simple cooking methods like sourdough and old-fashioned pickling that yielded pickles and krauts. And those foods were so nutritious, they were so digestible. And when we ate back then, when we ate like that, the modern diseases we have today were not as rampant. So at traditionalcookingschool.com and the Know Your Food podcast with Wardee, we are all about returning to those old-fashioned traditional cooking methods. This is not about making your life harder or heaping on the burdens of all the other things you have to do. No, because if you're cooking from scratch and you believe in healthy food and food that heals your body, you're simply changing your methods up a little bit and you're cooking from scratch in other ways. And as I'm about to show you, and I hopefully have demonstrated time and time again in all the weeks past, that traditional cooking actually doesn't take more time. You're cooking anyway. It doesn't take more time. You're being smart and you're using simple methods, and a lot of traditional cooking foods cook themselves. So instead of slaving over a stove, you're facilitating stages and steps. And Meg is saying exactly, yes. Glad to hear that. Meg herself is a wonderful, wonderful cook. If you're not already following my friend Megan from eatbeautiful.net, you should be. And Megan is such a good friend and is here in the audience supporting. Thank you for the hearts. Keep them coming. And as you are listening along, feel free to chime in the comments, either with thumbs up, stars. Please do include your first name because I can read it more easily. If you include that, the handle is pretty light, but your comments are not. Okay, so let's jump in with the 5 more tips I have for you today. One of them I kind of briefly just alluded to, and that is to preserve foods through fermentation, not canning. Now, you guys know I love fermentation, and if you don't already, well, let me say it. I love fermentation. It's not only healthy, probiotic foods are kind of a buzzword and people are all about them. Well, you make probiotic foods through old-fashioned pickling, which is called fermentation, and I love it. I've been fortunate to be the author of The Complete Idiot's Guide to Fermenting Foods that receives great reviews and has been very helpful in helping many cooks across the world bring fermentation into their kitchens. And so many people have written to me about how it's changed their lives, and I'm so happy to hear it. Well, here's the thing. Many of us, we might be into homesteading or we have gardens and we want to preserve our food. And in our modern world, people talk about preserving foods through canning. And I've done canning, and I still do a little bit of canning. However, something in me always kind of rebelled, because you're a slave to a hot stove. It's hot summer, and you're just heating up your house with gobs of heat and moisture, and it's really time intensive. And the high heat and sometimes pressure can dramatically reduce the nutrition of fresh foods. Well, fermentation is the exact opposite in many, many ways, because like I said before, traditional cooking is often foods that cook themselves, and fermenting is no exception. Fermented foods kind of cook themselves. The word fermentation is from the Latin fervere, which means to boil, and that's because fermented foods look like they're boiling. The fermenting organisms are producing gases, and so the foods bubble, so it looks like it's boiling, and we say it's kind of cooked themselves. Well, they're not cooking with heat. It's a fermentation process of the organisms consuming the starches and sugars in food and producing all kinds of wonderful things, including those gas bubbles. And the process happens totally hands-off, where like cabbage can be transformed into kraut, or cucumbers are transformed into pickles. And all you did at the very beginning of the process was like pack your cucumbers in jars and add some garlic and pour brine over the top and cap it and put it at room temperature, and those naturally abundant organisms do the work of preservation of turning it into pickles. Similar with kraut. You chop your cabbage, mix with salt, pack in a jar, leave it for a few days, and it transforms itself into a fermented food. So how easy does that sound compared to really hands-on slaving over a hot stove canning? Doesn't it sound a lot easier? Now, I'm not saying that canning doesn't have its place, because there's wonderful foods that you can can: tomatoes, beans, meats. And there's certain benefits of canning, where fermented foods need to be in cold storage to preserve them long term. Canned foods can, go in your pantry shelf. So I'm not saying do away with canning, but one way you can save yourself time when you're preserving the bounty of the harvest or certain foods that are in season is to look at methods of fermentation, and your workload may be dramatically reduced. And if you have freezer space or extra cold storage space, ferment a bunch of pickles and kraut and salsa and all these different foods and store them that way, and your hands-on time has been reduced. And I hear in the comments you're enjoying this kind of history lesson. Yeah, it's just one of those things that the Latin history of the word fervere really stood out to me when I first got into fermentation. And I love the bubbles too. It's the hallmark of fermentation. Not all fermented foods bubble, but I think, don't we all love it when we have a really happy ferment? And when I say happy, I mean it's bubbly. So I make sauerkraut quite often, and I just love it when it's happy. It's bubbling like crazy. So it's really fermenting away. So that was tip number 1, to look at fermentation instead of canning. Tip number 2, it's a particular method of fermentation. Carrots seem to be especially happy, K.M. Brooks says. Yes, they do. So there's a particular method of fermentation you can apply when you make your sauerkraut to save you loads of time. Now, I think traditionally sauerkraut, families or even communities would grow just loads and loads of cabbage, and a whole family would come together and make gallons and gallons of sauerkraut, and they would be pounding and pounding and pounding for hours to release the juices in the cabbage so that the cabbage would have enough brine to cover itself when it's packed in those big crocks or barrels or whatever they're fermenting it in. Well, we could do that today, and people do today, and there's beautiful kraut pounders on the market. I have 2 of them that you can pound vegetables with, or pack things in jars. But there's no need to pound your sauerkraut. You do this method, and this is tip number 2. It's called no pound kraut. You're simply shred your cabbage, mix it with the right amount of salt, and that's about ½ tablespoon to 1 tablespoon of salt per medium head of cabbage. And cabbages vary in density, so I'm talking about like a medium density, like a head of cabbage you pick up and you say, oh, this has got good weight. It's not one of those cabbages you pick up and you go, oh, that was light. That's a light density cabbage. So I'm talking about a medium density cabbage. About ½ to 1 tablespoon of salt per that. So you shred the cabbage, you mix it with your salt, you put it in a well, it's in a big bowl. You mix it in a big bowl, cover it with cheesecloth or a towel or something to keep dust and bugs out. And thank you for the hearts. And sometimes I'm on Periscope and I'm like, what is with the color I get today? It's brown. Well, today I've got beautiful pink hearts. I think it's probably because I'm wearing a pink shirt. I have this theory that the hearts come on Periscope based on the colors in the video. So maybe it's good that I'm wearing pink lipstick and a pink shirt because I'm getting some better colors today. Anyway, side note. So you cover your bowl of shredded cabbage that's salted, and the salt helps to pull the juices out of the cabbage for you. That's how you skip the pounding. And over the course of a half hour to an hour, that cabbage gets good and juicy. If you take a spoon and you dip in and you get to the bottom, you will have a pool of salty brine there. Amanda, I'm so glad you made it live. Welcome. So that's the beauty of no pound kraut. So after a half hour, 30 minutes to an hour, you've got this juicy kraut you're packing in jars. And over the next 24 hours, the salt is going to continue to juicy up the cabbage. That's not really a word. You know what I mean. It's going to get juicier. So by 24 hours, you need to be in the jar again, packing it down. So by 24 hours, the cabbage is completely submerged by the brine. So recap, you could be pounding your cabbage for half hour or so, or you could shred it, mix it with salt, and just let the salt do the work for you. Now, does that save time? Yes, it saves a ton of time. It makes sauerkraut so easy. I call it no pound kraut. No pounding required. Who here has done no pound kraut? Sev is asking, can any appliance be used to replicate that, using a mixer maybe? The pounding? Well, I'm advocating you don't have to do it at all. And as far as shredding, you can use a food processor. I actually prefer to shred just with a knife because I like bigger shreds. Megan is saying, yes, she's done it because of me. Great. And Sev is saying, me. So you've done it too. Good. Well, keep enjoying that time saving, because then you during that half hour to an hour, read a book to your children or get on with something else. And I do not know what your name is, but I've made it just last week. Great. Amanda's saying still learning about traditional foods, so one day soon, I hope. Great. And Laura, I like to massage it. Yes, I mean, it doesn't mean you can't massage it or pound it. But if you just let it take care of itself, it can make great strides without you. So massaging is kind of like a compromise. Okay, so tip number 3. I guess, we're kind of on a fermenting focus today on these tips. They're time-saving tips that are really focused on fermentation for the most part. So number 3 is to keep brine on hand. My basic brine, well, let me step back a bit. What am I talking about? Brine is what you pour over like solid vegetables like carrot sticks or cucumbers or asparagus spears. Something that's solid that's not going to produce its own brine like a relish or the kraut I was just talking about. You actually have to mix salt and water together and pour them over your vegetables in a jar. And that brine, that salty brine, is going to protect the fermenting organisms and deter the spoiling organisms. And of course, salt tastes good. So salt is so important. So fermentation, you need salt. And so with those solid vegetables, you need a brine. Well, you can keep brine on hand. My basic recipe for brine is 6 tablespoons of sea salt, which, by the way, sea salt, unrefined sea salt, not white sea salt, but sea salt that has color, browns and pinks and golds. 6 tablespoons of that dissolved in a half gallon of water. So you can make it a half gallon or a gallon at a time, and it's so convenient. Like in the height of the summer, when you're bringing in loads of cucumbers from the garden, and you have brine on hand, you pack you rinse the cucumbers, cold water, trim off the edges, pack them in the jars, cover with brine. And if you have a jar of that, you just, literally in 5 minutes, you could have 6 to 8 quarts of cucumbers fermenting away. And keep it in the pantry. So the idea is you have your brine ready and then you're pouring it over veggies for a quick fermentation assembly. And it does work for most fermentations. I do want to say that occasionally, and I don't know why, but occasionally I will have jars crack if I keep brine on hand. I think there's some kind of like fermentation activity happening with the water and the salt. It could be part of the water, it could be part of the salt or heat. So just be aware of that. I think it happens like maybe two to three times out of, no, I'm not going to say 2 to 3 times. I'm going to say percent, like maybe 2% of the time, a very small percentage of the time I could have a jar crack. And we've got a question coming in from Jamie. Do you put lids on the jars? I do put lids on the jars, and it will keep. I think, Kimmy, I saw you ask a question, how long does it last? Well, I've had brine on hand for months. It doesn't really go bad. The salt kind of preserves the water. And, you know, I've had it for months, and I probably shouldn't have made that much. But, you know, make enough brine, like for a couple weeks in the summer when you know you're going to be pulling things in from the garden and you constantly need it. Just, you know, you don't have to think years ahead or even months ahead, but think weeks ahead. You know, make a half gallon or a gallon at a time and use it up in a couple weeks. Scale back. And then just keep an eye on that jar cracking thing. Because if it happens, there's something with your salt or water and your environment. And I'm not going to advocate using plastic necessarily, but you could look at like BPA-free plastic. I don't know. I'm not going to advocate that, but it is an option. I'm not saying I don't advocate that. I'm saying I need to look into it more if plastic is a viable alternative. I just don't know one way or the other. Okay, so tip number 4 here is sourdough bread that makes itself. You know, whether you're doing a no-knead sourdough bread or you're doing like a kneaded sourdough bread, most of it happens without you. And if you have some great kitchen appliances that can do the work for you, like, you know, you fill the hopper. I have a Nutrimill that grinds flour, so I fill the hopper on the Nutrimill, and I'm in the kitchen doing other things, but it's grinding away, which is far different than when I used to grind flour in a Vitamix and I'd be active hands-on with the tamper. So it really depends on your grinding appliance. If you're acquiring the flour yourself, of course, you're totally skipping that. But the real key here is a no-knead recipe. And the no-knead recipe that I follow is either our bucket dough that's in the sourdough e-course or sourdough A to Z ebook. Thank you for the hearts, and they continue to be pink and pretty. Or I follow the einkorn no-knead bread that's in the Jovial Foods einkorn cookbook that I love. And all those are so easy. I do it like every other day at least. I either do it depending on when I need the loaf of bread, but I'm usually doing it the night before. And so it takes literally like 3 minutes to combine flour, starter, water, and salt in a bowl and mix it. Kay and Brooks, for your e-course, have super detailed directions. Yes, we do have super detailed directions. And if you're a member of Traditional Cooking School, we have super detailed videos to go along with it. We're currently working on the einkorn baking e-course, and coming up in December, I will have a no-knead einkorn bread coming up. But for now, we have the sourdough e-course bucket dough that my friend Christina teaches. Okay, so it literally takes 3 minutes to combine the 4 ingredients you need: starter, flour, salt, and water, and mix. It takes 3 minutes to put them in the bowl and mix them, cover it. This is the night before. The next morning, I preheat the oven. I like to add a little bit of baking soda. So all I do is sprinkle a little bit of flour on the counter so the dough is workable. I plop the dough in the flour, I sprinkle some baking soda, and I fold it maybe 15 or 20 times to work in the baking soda. I put it in a preheated Dutch oven that was in a preheated hot oven, and I put it back in the oven with the dough inside. So the Dutch oven is hot, the oven is really hot, like 425 degrees. I put the dough in there, and it rises and bakes beautifully. If you're using all-purpose flour, you don't need the baking soda. If you're using whole grain flour, you don't need the baking soda, but the baking soda just reacts with the acid in the starter and gives a lift, so it rises better if it's whole grain flour. And 45 minutes later, I'm pulling a beautiful loaf out of the oven and turning it out onto a cooling rack. Kay and Brooks, I have a Lodge ceramic-covered cast iron Dutch oven. I think it's a 5.5 or 6 quart. It's on Amazon. If you're a member of Traditional Cooking School and you go to our einkorn baking resources page, I have a link right to it. So go back and let's just add up the time that took. So 3 minutes to combine the ingredients, and then the starter prepared the dough and rose it and pre-digested the gluten and everything like all night long. And then it took less than 5 minutes well, it takes a couple seconds to put the Dutch oven in the oven and preheat. So maybe we're up to 4 minutes now. And then it takes about a minute to work in the baking soda, put it in the Dutch oven and put it in the oven. So that's another minute, so that's 5 minutes. And then, less than a minute, you're taking it out of the oven and putting it on a cooling rack. I wrap it in a towel so the crust softens because it gets quite a crust. So 5-minute bread. So see what I mean? Sourdough bread that makes itself. It took a total of 5 minutes from the night before to in the oven because it does all the work, and I just facilitated a bunch of steps. And that's how we have the most delicious, seriously, my husband says it's the best bread he's ever had, and our kids. It's the most delicious and the healthiest fresh home-baked bread you could have, and it took me 5 minutes of hands-on time. I just can't get any easier. And if you're doing a kneaded recipe and you have like a Bosch or something to do the kneading for you, and then the sourdough, of course, is the same. It's doing all the pre-digestion and rising, etc. Bread can be really easy and it's not like one of those things where it's no harder than cookies is what I'm trying to tell you. So if you're already cooking from scratch, you can do bread too. So that was tip number 4. And was that tip number 4? Yep, that was tip number 4. Okay, so I have more tips. I said I had 5 and then I have tips from listeners. Okay, so actually my 5th tip is from a listener because it's so good. It's soaked oatmeal for breakfast and it comes from Beth. And I could have counted all the tips, but these were the first 5 I counted, okay? So this is what Beth said. She left this at a comment on a previous episode. Thank you for the hearts, everyone. She said, I'm the oatmeal eater in my family of 2. I always soak and cook enough oatmeal for breakfast for 3 or 4 days. I add the cinnamon, raisins, and maple syrup when I cook it. And then after I enjoy the first piping hot serving, I put the rest in a container in the fridge. I reheat the other servings in a Pyrex bowl in my toaster oven, or especially in the summer, I enjoy it cold like rice pudding. When I finished the last serving, so remember she's had it for 3 or 4 days, she cooked it once, she had a piping hot bowl the first day, and then she put the rest in the fridge. So, that lasted her for at least 2 or 3 more days, just reheating it or eating it cold. When she finishes the last serving, I try to remember to soak more oatmeal by placing it in a covered Pyrex casserole dish in the back of the oven with a light on. The light provides just enough warmth and reminds me I have oatmeal soaking in there, and then the process repeats. So isn't that cool? You make oatmeal for 1 morning and you have breakfast for 4. Just a great, great tip. Soaked oatmeal for 3 to 4 days. Really, really easy. Thank you for that great tip, Beth. All right, so our final tips are a whole host of tips. These are bonus tips, come from Lise. Or I'm not sure if I should say Lisa, but it's spelled L-I-S-E. And thank you so much, Lisa, or Lise. She is writing in from Brittany, France, where she lives. She's been loving the time-saving tips. And she said she lived our lifestyle, which traditional cooking lifestyle, simple lifestyle, I'm assuming she means, with her late husband for 12 years in Cornwall, England. So her first tip is women working together. And I love this tip. I love it. And I think probably where she lived, maybe communities are closer than we are now, but I don't see why if you have a close group of women, you couldn't do that too. Thank you, Kimmy, for loving the soaked oatmeal tip. I do too. So women working together. She says, I believe women should work together whenever possible. She started with new moms who found motherhood, which I think is like so amazing if new moms could do this together, or older moms do this and bring in new moms, because the first time you're a mother is the roughest going, right? I mean, that was my experience. It's the biggest change. Adding the additional children, you've already kind of, transitioned to life with a young child, but the first one is the hardest. Thank you for the hearts. They're continuing to flow and they're so pretty. So she said they do a 5-day rotation, or they work together to bless, well, I'm not sure exactly, but they all meet at one home on Monday, and they do group cleaning and cooking and childcare, etc. So the benefiting homemaker will provide the lunch. And at the same time, the benefiting homemaker is providing the dinner. So, all the other mothers go home, and the dinner then has already been fixed with the lunch. So they've just done a ton of stuff for that woman in her home on Monday. And now this is making sense. So it's a 5-day rotation. So if there's 5 of them, then the next day they spend a couple hours at the next mother's home, and they do the group cleaning, cooking, and childcare together. The benefiting mom is providing the lunch and cooking her dinner for that night. And so 5 days a week, they're just women working together to group do these things that benefit their families. Isn't that a lovely idea? I mean, if you had some neighbors that were really close, or family members that were really close, a small village or a small town where you could do that, I know, it's amazing, isn't it? What a lovely, lovely tip, Lise. Thank you so much. And Lise has some other tips for us, so I'm just going to continue sharing the things that she did for her 12 years living this lifestyle with her husband in Cornwall, England. Sev, I love it too. She says she did a 4-week seasonal menu. So it rotated versus the seasons. So she said she lived in a small town with a market, so she had a lot of seasonal foods available. And so this 4-week seasonal menu allowed her to know what she was getting before shopping, so that helped with, being frugal and planning and all that. I didn't spend excessive amount of time trying to figure things out. She knew what she was doing based on the seasons. It also allowed her to change with the seasons. So that's a really great, you have to put in some effort to do that seasonal menu, but once you have it, can't you imagine the kind of time you would save shopping and also money? So that's a great tip from Lise. Another one, she and her friends would do group purchases whenever possible. They would contact local producers and they would go in on these group purchases, so that would save everybody money and time. Another tip, she did a lot of doubling up and freezing so she'd have a less pressured lifestyle. Like she would, she calls it crumble. She said it's possibly crumb in American English, but I think crumble works in our country too. But crumb topping for on top of coffee cakes or cobblers or whatever. She would do like a bulk making of that. And then she would store it in a jar in the fridge. So whether it's flour and butter or nuts, flour and butter, maybe cinnamon or cloves or whatnot, she would make more than she needed for a recipe, store it in a jar in the fridge. And so then if she's baking something, later on, she can just, put the crumble on top and bake that. I love that. And you can, I have talked about that in other recipes. Other podcasts in this series on doubling up and doing things in bulk, so it's the same kind of thing. Sev is saying her cousin does the group purchasing in Alaska, and somebody just a little bit ago said that Weston A. Price chapters often do group buys, and definitely, if you're interested in group purchases, going back to this tip, see if Azure Standard is in your area, and then contact them. They would probably have a local person who's running the co-op, and you can get in on those buys. They'll have a monthly or bi-monthly or every other month, I don't know which bi-monthly means, delivery date. So anyway, 2 more tips for you. Minimal everything and sharing larger items ensures your cash flow is not wasted. So her examples were, she shares her food dryer and her large mincer where she grinds meat, fruit, and vegetable. And so she shares those with her closer community members. And I'm assuming that others have larger things that they share as well, like maybe it's a mill or a mixer, maybe it's a canner, maybe it's a big crock for fermenting. Anyway, they're sharing it, and the side benefit of that, she points out, is it enables a social time when possible. And the final tip that Lise shared is she uses vegetable water and surplus juice from stewed fruit for soup and other fruits. And she'll freeze them into cubes if necessary. So it's very frugal. She's saving the water and surplus juice, and then she's using it in other recipes. And the way she keeps it fresh is to freeze it in frozen cubes. Don't you love those tips? So I just want to see everybody give a lot of hearts to Lise for sharing all these wonderful, inspiring tips. And what I love about them is the feeling of community and people joining together that is just kind of overflowing in these tips. It's just so, so lovely. So I am at the end of my tips now. So if you guys have questions, I have like 3 minutes to take questions only, because as I told you today, this is my 4th third of 4 live events. And so I have a member meeting coming up here in just a couple minutes. So I don't know your name, but weaning off gaps, at what point could I consider trying soaked, I don't know, maybe the oatmeal? I don't know the answer to that. I think when you're coming off gaps, I believe it's like there's a couple grains you start off on. You'd have to refer to your gaps book. I think one of them is, I don't know the answer to that, but I know the gaps book shares what to wean off of and what things you can start. Jamie's asking, with the no pound kraut, do you pack it in jars after sitting in the bowl for 1 hour? Yes, you pack it in jars. Even if the brine doesn't fully cover it yet, it's going to continue to release the juices for 24 hours. So a couple times during that 24-hour period, or at least at the end, pack it down again. We have wonderful scope. I learned so much from you, Tina. Thank you. And I missed a question. I saw it, but I was reading 2 at a time. Something about sourdough. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I really appreciate it. And for the love and the hearts, this is very fun to record Know Your Food with Wardee live with you. So I'm going to sign off here and encourage you all to visit the show notes, knowyourfoodpodcast.com/138. Of course, when the podcast is released, because you'll see links and more pertaining to all the tips that were shared today. And I'd love to have your comments there as well. And please consider, if you missed the fun today on the live recording, watching Periscope, my handle @TradCookSchool, on a future Thursday for a future recording of Know Your Food with Wardee podcast. Now, next Thursday happens to be Thanksgiving. I will not be recording my podcast on Thanksgiving. I'm going to be doing it earlier in the week. I'm not sure when yet. So watch next week sometime, and hopefully you'll catch me live. I'll try to give a heads up, but I'm not exactly sure what my schedule is going to be like next week. Okay, thanks for joining me, everyone. God bless you, and see you again soon.